I was completely clueless when I helped my grandma cover a dead body with dirt. My name is Claire. When I was a kid, my parents sent me to my grandparents' house in the suburbs for a few weeks almost every summer. I absolutely loved it there. My grandma was obsessed with gardening. The backyard was always bursting with flowers, especially roses. My grandpa usually just sat on the porch, watching her tend to the plants, only helping out every once in a while. In my memory, everything about that place was incredibly peaceful. That was until the summer I turned 12. That year, before I went down to visit, my parents told me that my grandparents weren't living together anymore. I overheard them whispering that my grandpa had found someone else and walked out. Grandma was heartbroken, but when I arrived, she acted completely normal, just like any other year. In fact, the garden looked even more beautiful than I remembered. The rose bushes were blooming so thick that they practically hid the black fence. One afternoon, I went out to the garden to help Grandma plant some new roses. While I was digging up the dirt, I saw her dragging a pretty heavy burlap sack toward the back of the garden. A deep pit had already been dug there. Curious, I ran over and asked her what it was. She just smiled and told me it was some fertilizer Grandpa had left behind. She said it was great for the plants, but it smelled a bit funky. I didn't think twice about it. I helped her push the sack into the pit, and together we covered it with dirt. But a few days later, I started noticing a foul odor around the house. At first, it was just a faint whiff, but as the weather got hotter, the smell got worse. It was especially strong near the back corner of the garden. I even complained to Grandma that the smell was unbearable. She told me it was just the typical scent of organic fertilizer, and that this specific kind always smelled that way. After a heavy rainstorm, the odor died down a bit, but it didn't go away completely. It just became damp and metallic. Grandma started keeping the back windows tightly shut so the smell wouldn't drift inside. Eventually, I got used to it and stopped paying attention. Aside from that, it was still a very fun summer. The roses bloomed beautifully that year. They were much bigger and more vibrant than in any other year. I even asked Grandma if I could set up a tent and camp out in the yard because I loved the garden so much. Over the next few years, I kept up the tradition of staying with Grandma every summer to help her garden. But the roses never bloomed as big or as beautiful as they did during that one summer. By the time I went off to college, Grandma passed away from old age. After she died, the house sat empty. The garden slowly withered away. The flowers died off, and the weeds completely took over the yard. I stopped going back there for the summers. Years later, now that I was an adult, my mom called me out of the blue. She said the family was planning to sell Grandma's house. She told me that if I wanted to keep any keepsakes, I should go take a look soon, because the house would be gone before long. So, that weekend, I drove back to the place where I had spent so many childhood summers. While packing things up, I found Grandma's old gardening journal. Inside, she had written detailed notes on how to care for each type of rose. Looking out the window at the overgrown yard, I missed her terribly. I decided right then to clean up the garden one last time. That afternoon, I went to the store, bought some gardening tools, and started tilling the dirt at the very back of the yard. As I was digging, my shovel suddenly struck something hard underneath. At first, I assumed it was just a rock, but when I bent down and brushed the dirt away, I saw an unusually long off-white object. I picked it up to get a closer look, and a cold shiver ran through my body. It looked exactly like a human bone. My heart started racing. I kept digging around the area, and before long, the shape of a human skull appeared in the dirt. I stood there frozen in shock for a long time before pulling out my phone to call the police. The backyard was quickly taped off as a crime scene. While the detectives questioned me and excavated the back corner of the garden, the memories of that summer when I was 12 came rushing back. This was the exact spot where I had stood next to Grandma, helping her shovel dirt over the heavy sack she claimed was fertilizer. The realization turned my blood to ice, and I immediately told the police everything. That same day, my parents rushed down to the suburbs after hearing that human remains had been found in the garden. No one in the family talked much over the next few days while we waited for the forensics report. Everyone had a sinking feeling that whatever was about to be revealed would be horrific. And it was. Eventually, the investigation confirmed that the skeleton buried in the corner of the yard belonged to my grandpa. The autopsy showed that Grandpa had died from a severe skull fracture caused by blunt force trauma. The timeline matched up perfectly with the exact time they had separated, and when Grandma claimed he had walked out on her. Based on the evidence dug up from the yard, the police concluded that Grandma had murdered Grandpa and buried his body in the backyard to cover up her crime. But since Grandma had already passed away years ago, the case was officially closed. The part that haunts me the most isn't just that my sweet Grandma was a killer. It is the fact that during the entire summer I was 12, I had cluelessly helped her bury my grandpa in that garden. And every day after that, I ran around, played games, and admired the beautiful roses growing right on top of his grave, completely unaware of what was hidden just beneath my feet. Back in elementary school, I was really close friends with Joseph. He was my classmate, and we lived in the same neighborhood. It was a Friday. After school ended, we snuck away from our parents and went into the thick pine forest behind the school to play hide and seek. That forest was strictly off limits for kids, but to us back then, the more something was banned, the more exciting it became. After searching for a pretty long time, it started to get dark. The air around me grew cold, and I began to lose my cool and feel scared. I yelled out at the top of my lungs that I gave up, and I told him to come out so we could go home. I shouted several times, but nobody answered. I figured I was being pranked. I thought Joseph had probably run home ahead of me, leaving me all by myself. My fear turned into anger. I turned around and stomped back home, feeling incredibly bitter because my friend had ditched me. That frustration didn't last very long. That exact same evening, my parents suddenly announced that we were going on a camping trip for the weekend. So, over that weekend, I was absolutely thrilled. I enjoyed the trip and completely forgot about the bitterness from the hide-and-seek game with Joseph. At the start of the next week, I went back to school and saw a big crowd gathering right by the front gate. I recognized Joseph's mom. Her face looked completely exhausted and her eyes were swollen from crying. She was handing out missing person flyers to anyone passing by. As I walked past, she suddenly noticed me and blocked my path. She dropped to her knees right in front of me, bursting into tears, and asked if I knew where Joseph was. She told me he hadn't come home since Friday afternoon. I was completely shocked when I heard the news. But looking into her eyes, I only felt fear. I knew we had broken the rules by going into the woods. My parents were very strict, and I knew I would get grounded or spanked for disobeying them. I didn't dare to look at Joseph's mom anymore. I lied straight to her face, saying I didn't know anything because I had been away camping all weekend. As soon as I said that, I yanked my hand away from her grip and dashed into my classroom. Throughout that entire day, a heavy feeling of anxiety hung over me. I couldn't focus on a single school lesson. The second school let out, I rushed straight into the forest to look for Joseph. I only had one thought in my head. If Joseph really never went home, then he had to still be inside this forest. I had to find him myself to fix my mistake, so nobody would ever find out that I lied. I ran non-stop to the exact area where we had played hide and seek the other day and searched all around. Joseph still wasn't there, but today I finally noticed something new. A large section of the ground had suffered a massive landslide, completely burying the deep, hollow tree roots where we usually love to hide. I had no idea when the landslide had actually happened. I didn't dare to stay there for another second and ran all the way home. I made up my mind right then to never tell a single adult what happened, and Joseph was never found. Years later, even when I moved on to middle school and then high school, I still felt a deep eating guilt every time I saw Joseph's mom. I hated myself for not telling the truth, that Joseph and I were playing in the forest behind the school on the exact day he went missing. She kept searching faithfully for many years. She would hold his photo and stand right in front of the school gate or on random street corners, desperately looking for her son. My name is Bethany, and this is the story of my harmonious family. To be clear, the family I'm talking about here is only my mother's side of the family. Throughout my childhood, I always felt a suffocating, forced atmosphere whenever my family gathered for parties or holidays. One important detail is that my parents got divorced when I was 6 years old. However, my dad still showed up at all of our family get-togethers. I don't remember him using those gatherings as an opportunity to be close to me. All that remains in my childhood memories is how uncomfortable everyone in the house looked, and the completely cold, detached expression on my mom's face. But the most noticeable thing of all was the attitude of my Aunt Dana, my mom's younger sister. My aunt always found every possible excuse to avoid my dad. She would never stand in the same room or lock eyes with him. Even though I was way too young back then to understand, her extreme avoidance always made me wonder. And those questions were finally answered when I was 12 years old. That day, I went over to my aunt's house to hang out with my cousin, who is her daughter and a year younger than me. I was staying over for a sleepover. For context, my aunt was a single mother. Since my aunt had to work the night shift, my cousin and I started coming up with all kinds of mischievous games to pass the time. My cousin came up with the idea to play detective, so we began rummaging through the whole house to find evidence left by a suspect. We had no idea that we were about to uncover evidence that would expose a real-life criminal. After finishing our search in the living room, the two of us excitedly moved into my aunt's bedroom. We ran through her dresser drawers, thinking we would find some cool makeup to play with, but instead, we accidentally pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper hidden deep at the very bottom of the wardrobe. Naturally, curiosity got the best of us. We stopped looking for cosmetics and opened it up to read right away. To this day, I can't remember every single word written in that letter, but the main point was about how heartbroken and exhausted my aunt was. She wrote that she could no longer bear the horrific trauma she was carrying. The most shocking part was a line where she stated that my dad was the one who had destroyed her life. The letter ended with a desperate final goodbye to the family. I was absolutely terrified, and my cousin started sobbing hysterically because we both thought my aunt was about to end her life. So, in the middle of the night, we held hands and ran all the way to my house with the letter to break the news to my mom and grandma. I will never forget the expressions on their faces when they read that note. I had never seen them so deeply shaken and hysterical. My grandma immediately called my aunt, demanding that she end her shift and come home right that second. When my aunt arrived, the confrontation took place at our house. My mom told me to take my cousin into the bedroom and go to sleep. I did what I was told and led my cousin to the room. But we didn't go to sleep. Instead, we pressed our ears flat against the bedroom door to eavesdrop on the adults. After a few minutes, I froze in fear as I heard my aunt burst into loud, agonizing wails. It turned out that a few years prior, right after my parents had separated, my mom left the house one afternoon. My aunt didn't know my mom was out and came over to visit. That was when the tragedy happened. My dad assaulted her right there in our family home. What was even more sickening was that he intentionally infected her with HIV and hepatitis B. Once the truth came out, my grandma and my mom were completely furious. The very next day, they called an emergency family meeting to confront my dad. Looking back on it now, his calm, indifferent attitude and the story he told are the most disgusting things I have ever witnessed. Faced with my family's rage, he openly admitted that he had no personal grudge against my aunt, and he hadn't even been sick before. It all started from a dare by one of his drug addict friends. The friend challenged him to play a twisted game of life and death, daring him to contract the diseases and use them to ruin someone else's life. So, my dad purposefully got himself infected by that friend. My aunt just happened to be a random target when he felt the urge to act. Hearing his explanation, my grandma was in such shock that her legs gave out and she collapsed. My family quickly called the police to have him arrested, determined to make him pay a heavy price. Finally, I understood the reason behind my aunt's extreme avoidance whenever she was in the same room as my dad. The story ended with that monstrous man I called my father, facing a long prison sentence for sexual assault and intentionally transmitting dangerous diseases to another person, but my family was completely shattered. My aunt received a lot of love and support from everyone, but she could never escape the trauma and psychological torture. She has to live on medication and in constant fear for the rest of her life. My cousin was also heavily traumatized after finding out the truth. As for me, I feel a deep sense of horror toward the man who gave me life. How could he do something so evil to the people closest to him, the people who were supposed to be his family? Did he not possess even a single drop of human emotion? Or did the drug addiction completely destroy his humanity? I have never gone to visit him in prison, and I never want to do it for as long as I live.
This story happened 10 years ago. I am telling it as someone who lived through it all, but even now, I'm not sure I fully understand everything that took place. Back then I was in high school, and my younger sister, Lily, was only in elementary school. To anyone who didn't know better, she seemed like a well-behaved child and a good student. But I always felt like something was very wrong with Lily. The first person to suffer because of her was Aunt Kate, my mother's sister. Aunt Kate had been blind since birth and lived with our family for a long time. She was very gentle, never complained, and always tried to be independent. But Lily saw Aunt Kate's disability as a form of entertainment. It started with sarcastic comments. Then, Lily began mimicking the way Aunt Kate felt her way around the house, with excitement. The pranks grew more cruel. Lily would intentionally leave objects in the hallway to make Aunt Kate trip. Once, I watched her stick her foot out just as Aunt Kate walked by. When our parents rushed in to help, Lily immediately acted like she was worried and innocent. It made me sick to my stomach, but at the time, I just thought she was being a bratty kid. Then, I started seeing much scarier things. There were always stray cats, small birds, and insects around our house. I noticed these animals appearing with strange injuries or tied up with string. Slowly, their numbers began to dwindle. One day, I went into Lily's room to get my headphones back and found a box hidden in her desk drawer. Inside were the remains of several small animals, insects pinned down, baby mice that had been cut open, and birds with their wings clipped. They were arranged like scientific specimens. I kept looking and found a notebook. In it, Lily wrote about a classmate with pure hatred. She wrote that she wanted to teach that girl a painful lesson and listed detailed ways to do it. I was stunned and truly terrified. I thought about telling my parents, but I stayed silent because I knew exactly what would happen if I spoke up. Lily always put on a sweet, fragile face in front of them. Meanwhile, I was the disappointment because I got into fights and had bad grades. Once before, when I tried to tell them Lily was hurting a stray cat in the yard, they didn't even listen. They immediately accused me of lying to get her in trouble. From that moment on, I knew my parents didn't trust me at all, so I kept my mouth shut. Everything began to change when Lily's eyesight suddenly started to fail. My parents took her to the doctor, who said it was partly genetics and partly because she spent too much time playing video games. The doctor recommended she wear glasses. Lily had a total meltdown. She used to make fun of kids who wore glasses, so there was no way she would wear them. She demanded contact lenses instead. My family was struggling financially. The cost of the lenses and the cleaning solution was a huge burden for my parents. Surprisingly, Uncle Robert, a distant relative on my dad's side, offered to pay for everything. This felt strange to me. Uncle Robert lived alone, wasn't wealthy himself, and our families weren't close. But because Lily kept begging, my parents accepted Uncle Robert's help. As soon as she started using the contact lenses, Lily had problems. She constantly complained that her eyes burned as if they were on fire from the inside. Her eyes were always red and watery, and she had to squint all the time. My parents thought she just wasn't used to them yet, so they encouraged her to keep wearing them. Lily refused to stop. To her, the physical pain was better than the embarrassment of wearing glasses. Then, her condition took a turn for the worse. In less than 2 months, the doctor delivered devastating news. Lily's corneas were severely damaged and could not be repaired. She went completely blind before the school year ended. My parents and Lily were absolutely crushed. After she lost her sight, Lily changed completely. She became quiet and withdrawn. She stopped bullying Aunt Kate. Sometimes, I even saw her sitting quietly by my aunt's side, just listening to her talk. At the same time, the animals around the house stopped getting hurt. They stopped disappearing. The backyard went back to normal. Everything seemed fine again. Until one day, I happened to walk past Uncle Robert's house. Behind his house is a garden where he used to feed stray cats and birds. That day, I noticed his trash can wasn't fully closed. Inside were several empty boxes of the same contact lenses Lily used. Right next to them were empty bottles of bleach. I stared at those items, and a chilling realization washed over me. Lily used to sneak into that garden all the time. I remembered seeing one of his cats badly injured, with cuts that didn't look like an accident. I remembered Lily throwing rocks at the bird nests behind his fence. I especially remembered Uncle Robert standing in his yard for a long time, staring at his garden with a dark, serious expression. I started to wonder, what if he had seen what Lily did to the animals he loved? If he had, then his offer to pay for her contacts wasn't an act of kindness at all. I thought about telling my parents, but once again, I changed my mind. I knew they still wouldn't believe me. And, if I'm being honest, a small, shameful part of me felt like she got what she deserved. To this day, I don't know if I made the right choice. I give half of my monthly paycheck to help my parents take care of Lily and Aunt Kate. I feel like it's my responsibility. I don't know for sure what Uncle Robert did, or if it was all just a coincidence. I have never told a soul about what I saw in that trash can, or the dark suspicions I carry in my heart. Lily had a total meltdown. She used to make fun of kids who wore glasses, so there was no way she would wear them. She demanded contact lenses instead. My name is Gray. This story happened 4 years ago, and it completely shattered my belief in human nature. At the time, I was a senior in high school in a small town in Ohio. One afternoon after school, I was walking past an abandoned house at the end of the block, just like I did every day. As I passed the side wall, I happened to notice a small combination lockbox mounted to the brick, right underneath an old gas meter. The lockbox stood out because it looked brand new compared to the decaying house. I kept walking, thinking maybe a realtor or a contractor had just put it there. But then it hit me. Why would anyone need a lockbox for a house that had been rotting and empty for years? The next morning, I grabbed my best friend Ryan and asked him to go back there with me. Ryan thought it was weird too, but he didn't obsess over it like I did. I've always been naturally curious, and I couldn't stop wondering about that house. Right as we were looking at it, Ryan's dad, Mr. Elton, drove by. When he saw us, he looked furious. He rolled down his window and yelled at us, telling us to stay away from abandoned properties because they were dangerous. We took off immediately. The following day, I went back to the house alone. I knew if I asked Ryan, he would just try to stop me. I just wanted one more look to satisfy my curiosity. When I got there, I noticed the lockbox had been moved slightly from the day before. I was positive of it. I reached out to touch it, and my fingers brushed against something wet. When I looked at my hand, it was smeared with a reddish-brown liquid that smelled exactly like iron. It was blood. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight to the police station to report it. An officer drove back to the house with me to check it out. They looked at the gas meter and the pipes behind the wall, and then gave me an explanation. They said it was just rusty water leaking from the old metal. They didn't even go inside. They just did a quick walk around and concluded there was nothing suspicious. The officer told me to go home and stop hanging around creepy, vacant lots. I left, but I wasn't convinced. A little while later, I circled back, and I was stunned to see Mr. Elton walking toward the abandoned house. I immediately ducked behind some bushes to watch. He walked right up to the lockbox, punched in a code like he'd done it 1,000 times, took out a key, and unlocked the front door. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. I stood there with my head spinning for a few seconds, then decided to wait and see what happened. About 30 minutes later, Mr. Elton walked out looking frustrated. He locked the door, put the key back in the box, and drove away. I waited until his car was out of sight before I approached the box. I tried to remember the movements his fingers made. After a few tries, the box clicked open. I was actually shocked that I had guessed the code. The key was right there. I held it in my hand, staring at the front door. My gut told me to run, but my curiosity won. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was thick and suffocating. The first floor was empty and unremarkable, but as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, I started to hear a faint whimpering sound. My heart started thumping against my ribs. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, and I was terrified, but I couldn't turn back. I followed the sound to a room at the end of the hallway. When I pushed the door open, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. 3 girls were chained to the wall. They looked horrific, haggard and terrified. When they saw me, they lunged forward as much as their chains would allow, their eyes pleading. One tried to speak, but no sound came out of her throat. I stood there frozen for a few seconds before my survival instincts kicked in. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pull out my phone to call 911. Just as I was about to dial, I heard the front door downstairs creak open. Footsteps started thumping on the floorboards below. The girls and I went dead silent. Only one thought went through my head. If Elton was back, we were all dead. As I scrambled to find a place to hide, a voice called out that shocked me even more than the thought of Elton. "I'm sorry I'm late." I stood still for a second and then sprinted down the stairs. I couldn't believe my eyes. Standing in the foyer was Emily, my younger sister. When she saw me, she looked just as confused as I was. I started shouting questions at her, and she told me she had received a letter from Mr. Elton. He had asked her to meet him here privately because he had something important to tell her. She had forgotten about the meeting and showed up almost an hour late. A wave of cold nausea washed over me. If Emily had been on time... I couldn't even finish the thought. 10 minutes later, the neighborhood was filled with sirens. Police and ambulances swarmed the house. The 3 girls were rescued, though they were physically and mentally broken. At the exact same time, another police unit raided Mr. Elton's office and arrested him at his desk in front of all his co-workers. They searched his office and his home, finding a mountain of evidence. The 3 girls he had been holding were all runaways who had been struggling with their families. Elton had lured them in through social media, promising them a place to stay. Instead, he brought them to that abandoned house, chained them up, and used them as his toys. The more I heard, the more disgusted I felt. Mr. Elton was my best friend's dad. I had known him for years. I had respected him, even looked up to him. He used to chat with Emily every time he came to my house to pick up Ryan. Back then, I just thought he was being a friendly neighbor. Now, looking back, I realized the way he looked at her was predatory. The thing that haunts me the most isn't the image of those girls in that upstairs room. It's the fact that my own sister was minutes away from becoming a monster's next victim. Ryan and I haven't spoken since that day. I lost my faith in the kindness of strangers, and I lost a lifelong friendship too. I live alone in a fourth-floor apartment of a 5-story building in Cleveland, Ohio. The building is old but well-maintained, and the neighbors mostly keep to themselves, so it is usually very quiet. Everything started to change one evening when I was coming home from work. As I walked from the parking lot toward the building, I happened to glance up and saw a silhouette standing behind a window on the 5th floor, directly above my unit. It would have been a perfectly normal thing to see, except for the fact that it happened every single day. For several days straight, I saw that same shadow in the window. Soon, looking up at that apartment became a reflex every time I returned home. One night, I got home quite late. When I stood in the parking lot and looked up, I had the chilling sensation that the figure was looking down, directly at me. The next morning, I found the building manager to ask about the unit above mine. He told me the tenant was a young woman named Megan. He said she had moved in about a month ago and lived a very private life. This information didn't make me feel better. Instead, it made me watch that shadow even more closely whenever I arrived home. Over the next few days, my uneasy feeling grew into a deep sense of dread. I noticed that the shadow never changed its position or posture, no matter what time of day I saw it. One afternoon, shortly after I got home, there was a knock at my door. 3 people stood there, claiming to be Megan's co-workers. 2 men did all the talking. They seemed visibly annoyed and complained that Megan had missed work for several days without calling in. I noticed the third person, a woman, who didn't say a word. She just stood there silently, staring at me the entire time. After I pointed them toward Megan's apartment, they thanked me and left. I heard the men knocking and calling her name, but no one answered. I assumed they eventually gave up and left, though I didn't pay much more attention to it. The real horror began the following night. I started to notice a strange smell in my apartment. Within a few hours, the odor became absolutely unbearable. Then, I discovered a dark, wet stain forming on my ceiling. A thick liquid began to drip down. The smell and the consistency of the fluid made me think of only one thing: death. I immediately called the building manager. The police were summoned, and they headed to the 5th floor. When no one answered their shouts, they kicked the door in. I was standing in the hallway right behind them, my heart pounding against my ribs as the door gave way. In that moment, I accidentally saw something I will never be able to forget. As the police stepped back out, the door remained open, and I saw a rotting body hanging in the middle of the room. The police identified the body as Megan. They determined she had been dead for at least a week. I was paralyzed with shock. That meant for the past several days, the shadow I had been seeing behind the curtain was actually her lifeless body. I was traumatized and moved out for a few days so the scene could be professionally cleaned. However, when I returned, the stain on my ceiling was still there. I complained to one of the cleaning crew members, and he told me that the stain was actually old and had been there long before this happened. He said it was impossible to remove. I froze. I realized I hadn't even noticed it since the day I moved in. For the next few days, I lived in a state of constant haunting, replaying the image of Megan's body in my mind. I started researching the building on a website that tracks apartments where murders or deaths have occurred. A piece of information popped up on the screen that made my blood run cold. 2 other women had died in Megan's apartment in the exact same way. The first woman was named Mariah. She had suffered multiple miscarriages and had a breakdown after discovering her husband was having an affair, and that his mistress was pregnant. Mariah had tracked down the mistress's apartment and ended her own life right there. The second tenant who moved in after her died the same way only a few months later. As I looked at the photo of Mariah on the website, my head began to spin. I recognized her instantly. She was the silent woman who had stood at my door with Megan's co-workers a few days prior. I realized with sheer terror that I had been standing face to face with a ghost. Suddenly, the air in my apartment turned ice cold. I couldn't think straight. I grabbed my phone and my car keys and bolted out the door. As I reached the lobby, I saw a young woman moving in. She looked very young and excited. Following the direction she was pointing for the movers, I realized she was moving into Megan's old apartment.
My name is Randy, and I'm 63 years old. The shadow hanging over my life started when I was 39. It happened in the small town of St. Bernard, Louisiana. A damp, humid place that always smelled like mud and was thick with stories that were never quite finished. In this town, the name Dorothy was famous for all the wrong reasons. She lived all alone on the grounds of a pet cemetery that sat far away from the rest of the neighborhood. People loved to spread rumors about her. Some said the cemetery was haunted. Others whispered she had a secret stash of hundreds of thousands of dollars buried somewhere. Some even called her a black widow because both of her husbands had died there. One she shot in self-defense during an attack, and the other took his own life. After her mother passed away 6 years ago, Dorothy fell into a deep depression. She relied heavily on medication and help from a few friends and hired hands to keep the place running. In April of that year, a close friend of Dorothy's called the cops because she hadn't heard from her in days. When the police arrived, the house looked normal. The TV was still on, and there was a half-finished glass of wine on the table. But Dorothy was gone. The news spread like wildfire. Every local hangout had a new theory. Some thought she just walked away, while others pointed to the haunted cemetery and her dark past. I heard the stories, but I didn't buy into the drama. I saw Dorothy as a lonely, harmless woman. Because of that, I joined the volunteer search party along with the police and some of her friends. We spent days combing through the woods around the cemetery, moving further out each time. The first few days were exhausting and frustrating because we found absolutely nothing. On the afternoon of the 5th day, I accidentally got separated from the group. I pushed deeper into the swampland where the air gets thick and smells like stagnant water and rotting plants. As I got closer to a stream that fed into the Mississippi River, I noticed something wrong. The water was rippling strangely, and there was a foul smell that was much worse than the usual swamp muck. I stepped closer, and then I saw it. A body was floating there, bloated and pale gray. The arms were tied tightly behind the back. The head was covered with a plastic bag, and heavy chains were wrapped all around the torso. I ran to get the search team. Just as we feared, it was Dorothy. The police taped off the area and pulled her to the shore for the autopsy. The coroner ruled that she died from suffocation. The chilling part was how the killer did it. They put a plastic bag over her head, tied her limbs tight, and wrapped her in heavy iron chains to make sure she stayed at the bottom of the river forever. They could only identify her by a cross tattoo on her left index finger. A month went by, and the police had zero leads on the killer. One afternoon, I stopped by a local diner I always went to. On the bulletin board near the door, a faded "missing" flyer for Dorothy was still pinned up. I ordered a beer and sat in a quiet corner. A man walked up and asked to join me. I recognized him because I'd seen him a few times during the search for Dorothy. He had a distinct scar that ran from his forehead down his right eyelid and ended at his cheek. He didn't give me his name, even after I asked. We clinked glasses and talked about random things until the conversation eventually drifted toward Dorothy's murder. Right then, the air in the room felt like it turned to ice. His friendly look vanished. His eyes went dark and distant. He started talking about how easy it is for someone to disappear in the swamp. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he let out details that made my skin crawl. Exactly how a body needs to be tied, how to cover the head, and exactly how many times the chains need to be wrapped so it never floats back up. I didn't say a word, but my whole body went stiff with fear. Suddenly, he stopped and stared right at me. The fake friendliness was gone. He looked cold. He spoke slowly, making it sound more like a fact than a warning. Some things are better left lost, and people who know too much, they don't get to live quiet lives. He finished his beer, flashed a polite, empty smile like nothing had happened, and walked out. I just sat there, my mind blank, drenched in a cold sweat. I didn't go to the police about that meeting. I didn't tell a soul. I was haunted by his eyes, but I convinced myself I had no real proof. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe the guy was just crazy. Over time, the case went cold. No suspects, no progress. It became just another old story. Nearly 20 years later, as my health started to fail and the quiet moments got longer, the memory of Dorothy and that man became unbearable. The image of that body in the muddy water played on a loop in my head. My fear turned into crushing guilt. I realized I had been holding the key to the whole mystery for 2 decades. I couldn't live with the silence anymore. I finally picked up the phone and made an anonymous call to the police. I told them everything about that man in the diner. The investigation was reopened with a real target. Using modern technology and records, they finally identified him. He was the killer. His name was Brandon Nodier. He had tricked Dorothy into signing over the cemetery for almost nothing while she was incoherent on her depression meds. When Dorothy realized she'd been scammed, she sued to get her land back. The court date was set for just 10 days after she disappeared. Brandon was desperate. If he lost, he'd lose the land and go to jail for fraud. To make sure the lawsuit died with her, Brandon and a handyman named James Trigler went to her house that night. When Dorothy opened the door, Brandon strangled her, bagged her body, and dumped her in the Mississippi. Justice finally came, but it was far too late. Dorothy had been gone for a lifetime, and I had spent all those years living with a fear and a guilt that can never truly be washed away. The story is inspired by a real-life case. In April 1985, in St. Bernard, Louisiana, Dorothy Thompson, 60, living alone in a pet cemetery, suddenly disappeared. 20 days later, her body was found bound, blindfolded, and submerged in the Mississippi River. The case remained unresolved for 24 years despite numerous suspects. In 2009, an anonymous call accused Brandon Nodier of murdering her to seize her land. He turned himself in 2012, closing the case.